They say the city never sleeps, and in the early 1920s, Chicago certainly didn't. The streets pulsed with jazz and danger, where the glow of speakeasy lanterns flickered like secrets in the dark. Prohibition had wrapped its fingers around the throat of the nation, but instead of choking crime, it gave birth to a new breed of empire, ruthless, elegant, and dripping with cash. Into this smoke-hazed underworld stepped a kid from Brooklyn, Alphonse Capone. Born to immigrant parents and bred in the back alleys of New York, Capone wasn't always the devil in a designer suit. As a teen, he danced on the edge of petty crime, dipping his fingers into small-time trouble. But it wasn't until he caught a train west headed straight for the meat-grinding heart of Chicago that his true story began. He didn't arrive alone. Not really. He came trailing the shadow of a man named Johnny Torrio, a criminal mastermind with a talent for turning chaos into capital. Torrio wasn't your dime store thug. He was methodical, calculating, and deadly polite. When Capone joined his crew, the older man saw more than a street-smart kid, he saw potential. And he was right. Torrio ran the city's black market booze business like a general leads an army. Speakeasies, brothels, gambling dens, the works. Capone rose fast, not because he was loud, but because he was effective. He could talk, charm, and when needed, turn a room red in seconds. Torrio trusted him, handed him disputes to settle, enemies to silence, deals to close. By the time 1925 rolled around, Capone had become his right hand. But power comes with a target. One cold day, Torrio found himself staring down the barrel of a rival gang's vendetta. Bullets flew, and when the smoke cleared, he was alive, barely. The brush with death shook him. A man like Torrio could read the writing on the wall. And what it said was, "Get out while you still can." So, he did. He packed up, stepped away from the throne, and handed the crown to Capone, a 26-year-old with ambition in his veins and a storm in his eyes. Capone didn't inherit the empire. He became it. But where Torrio whispered in corridors, Capone strutted down Main Street. He wore silk suits like armor, ate at five-star tables, and mingled with the city's elite like he owned them, which, in many ways, he did. Politicians, movie stars, even the beat cops, they all gave him that same look. Half fear, half admiration. To the desperate and the downtrodden, he wasn't just a crook. He was Robin Hood with a bankroll and a Tommy gun. He tossed cash to charity, fed the hungry, and made sure his name wasn't just spoken in whispers, it was shouted in awe. But make no mistake, beneath the smile and swagger was a man who built his kingdom on blood. He didn't ask for loyalty. He expected it. And anyone who didn't deliver, well, they didn't get a second chance. Capone's hands didn't just run booze. They throttled Chicago. He had judges on retainer, cops in his pocket, and rivals under the ground. Every corner of the city bowed or bled. And yet, every empire has its storm. And Al Capone's sky was beginning to darken. By the time the decade turned, Al Capone didn't just rule Chicago, he was Chicago. His liquor ran smoother than the trains, his brothels hummed behind velvet curtains, and his gambling halls glittered under gaslight. But while the public danced to jazz and lifted glasses in secret, the streets outside told a different tale, one written in gunfire and grief. See, for every empire there's a challenger. And for Capone, that man was George "Bugs" Moran, leader of the North Side Gang. Moran wasn't like the rest. He didn't play by Capone's rules, didn't pay off the police, didn't bow to the so-called king. Where Capone built his empire with bribes and charm, Moran sharpened his with grit and defiance. The two were locked in a bloody chess match. Alley by alley, block by block, their men hunted each other like ghosts in the fog. Deals soured. Guns barked in the dark. Chicago became a battleground, and Capone knew he couldn't keep dancing forever. So, he made a decision. He'd send a message, something no one could misinterpret. A final warning net in this game: there was only one throne, and he would not share it. The morning was cold, February 14, 1929. Snow crusted the sidewalks like powdered silence. Inside a garage on North Clark Street, 7 of Moran's men waited, thinking they were about to score a shipment of stolen whiskey. They never saw it coming. 5 men walked in dressed as police officers, badges flashing, voices firm. They ordered Moran's crew to line up against the wall. Routine, the gangsters thought. Just another shakedown. Then the gunfire started. Over 70 rounds shattered the quiet. In seconds, the garage floor was painted with history and blood. When the real police arrived, they found bodies riddled with bullets, sprawled like broken puppets on cold cement. One man, Frank Gussenberg, was still breathing. They asked him who did it. He looked up, chest heaving, and whispered, "Nobody shot me." That lie, soaked in blood, was the last thread of honor in a world without rules. Capone, conveniently, was hundreds of miles away in Florida. Sunshine on his face, cigar between his teeth. A perfect alibi. But everyone, the cops, the press, the people on the street, they all knew. He'd signed that massacre like an artist signs a masterpiece. The St. Valentine's Day massacre wasn't just a hit, it was a turning point. It shattered the illusion. Capone had danced on a tightrope between villain and folk hero, but this was too much. Too brutal. Too public. Headlines screamed. Politicians stirred. The city trembled, and the federal government finally opened its eyes. Capone had declared war not just on rival gangs, but on the very system that had allowed him to thrive. And for the first time, it was ready to fight back. The massacre cracked something in the public's gaze, that dangerous admiration that once made Capone a household name now curdled into fear. No longer a charming outlaw in tailored pinstripes, he was a menace, a tyrant too bold, too bloody, too big to ignore. And Washington took notice. For years, local lawmen had danced to Capone's tune, their pockets lined, their lips sealed. But now, embarrassed and enraged, the federal government stepped in with a plan not to shoot Capone down in the streets, but to choke him out by the wallet. Enter Elliot Ness. He wasn't some grizzled gumshoe with a bottle in his desk drawer. He was young, sharp, and too stubborn to buy or scare. The Treasury Department handed him the reins and told him one thing: bring Capone's empire to its knees. Ness didn't come alone. He handpicked a team of incorruptibles, agents with clean records and clear eyes. Together, they became legend, the Untouchables. No bribes. No deals. Just cold resolve and a badge. They didn't chase ghosts, they kicked in doors. Night after night, they raided speakeasies, seized barrels of illegal booze, shut down breweries that funneled Capone's millions. Every shipment lost was a vein cut in his empire. Every barrel smashed, another piece of power drained. At first, Capone laughed. He'd seen lawmen try before. A few grand here, a threat there, everyone had a price. But not these men. Ness and his crew kept coming. Relentless. Clean. Unshakable. For the first time in his reign, Capone felt something unfamiliar: pressure. But as Ness struck from the front, another enemy worked in the shadows, one Capone never saw coming. While the headlines roared about raids and bootleggers, a quiet team of IRS agents was flipping ledgers, not tables. Led by a methodical investigator named Frank J. Wilson, they pored over scraps of paper, tracked whispers of money, hunted the one weakness Capone never thought mattered: taxes. He'd murdered, bribed, threatened, and stolen and walked free every time. But he'd never filed a tax return. Capone had always kept his hands clean on paper. No signatures. No trails. Just cash and silence. But his empire was vast, and not all his men were careful. Somewhere, someone made a mistake. A receipt here, a ledger there. Wilson was building a case. It wasn't gunfire that would bring Capone down. It was arithmetic. As Ness battered the walls, and Wilson chipped away at the foundation, Capone's empire began to wobble. The king of Chicago was still on the throne, but the ground beneath him was starting to crack. By 1930, Capone still swaggered through Chicago like he owned the place, but the truth was, he was fighting shadows. Ness and his untouchables had turned the city's underworld into a minefield, while the IRS agents were tightening a noose he couldn't see but surely felt. So, Capone did what any desperate ruler does when the walls start closing in. He tried to rewrite the story. He launched a charm campaign. Public donations, soup kitchens, flashy interviews, all designed to repaint him as a generous businessman, a misunderstood provider just giving the people what they wanted: liquor, entertainment, jobs. And for a while, it worked. Crowds still gathered to glimpse the man in the immaculate suit. The press still ran his quotes with fascination. But beneath the smooth exterior, the truth was unraveling. Then came the blow he never saw coming: public enemy number one. The FBI gave him the label like a scarlet letter, and the newspapers ran with it. Suddenly, Capone wasn't a celebrity, he was a problem. A threat to the American dream in the middle of a national depression. Worse still, the Chicago Crime Commission published a detailed, damning report of everyone tied to Capone's operations. Judges, officers, politicians, no longer names whispered in back rooms, but headlines on every front page. And then, as if fate wanted to humiliate him personally, the state of Illinois revoked his gun license. The man who once ruled with firepower and fear was now, officially, just another criminal with an illegal weapon. But Capone didn't see the end. Not yet. He still believed money could fix anything. He still trusted that a smile and a wad of cash could make problems disappear. He didn't know that behind locked doors, Frank J. Wilson had uncovered the numbers, proof that Capone had earned millions and paid not a penny in taxes. The tipping point came in June 1931. The U.S. government filed formal charges, 22 counts of tax evasion. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't violent. But it was fatal. Capone laughed. He had judges on speed dial, jurors in his back pocket. He'd beaten worse. Or so he thought. The prosecution had a different plan. They switched the jury at the last minute, handpicking 12 men who'd been kept in isolation, far from Capone's reach. There were no bribes, no threats, no whispered deals. Just truth. And the numbers didn't lie. The trial began in the federal courthouse. Capone arrived like he always did, polished, confident, untouchable. But inside those walls, something had shifted. The law had caught up. And it wasn't asking anymore. The trial played out like a silent war: clean suits and cold stares, ledgers stacked like evidence of greed. The prosecutors didn't need to paint Capone as a killer, though the world knew he was. All they had to do was prove he was a liar, one who cheated the government while honest folks starved through the Depression. And they did. They brought receipts, bank statements, whispered testimonies from former accountants, all meticulously pieced together by Frank J. Wilson's quiet army of number crunchers. Capone's fortress, so carefully constructed with bribes and bullets, had overlooked the smallest crack: taxes. He sat in the courtroom like he had a dozen times before, smug and unworried. This was his city, his game. But as the evidence mounted and the jury listened, really listened, something in Capone began to falter. For once, he didn't control the room. The prosecutors played a masterstroke. They didn't just accuse him of dodging taxes, they cast him as a parasite feeding off the suffering of the working class. A man living in luxury while others scraped for scraps. The jury didn't just see numbers, they saw betrayal. And that sealed it. October 17, 1931. After just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. 5 counts of tax evasion. 11 years in federal prison, the harshest sentence ever handed down for that crime at the time. The courtroom, once Capone's stage, turned cold and final. Reporters shouted for a statement, but the gangster who had once charmed the press with flair and one-liners had nothing to say. His smirk had vanished. He had outlived gang wars, dodged bullets, outwitted lawmen, and ruled Chicago with a blood-stained crown. But in the end, it wasn't a rival gang or a hail of gunfire that brought him down. It was ink and numbers. They led him out of the courtroom in silence. No thunder, no glory, just the slow, measured footsteps of a man who had run out of exits. The king had fallen. At first, they sent him to Cook County Jail, a temporary holding cell for a man used to gold and velvet. But Al Capone, even behind bars, still thought he could bend the rules. When he was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, he brought his arrogance with him and his silk underwear. He bribed guards. Lived better than most. Smuggled in comforts. Even behind bars, Capone played the part of a boss. But the government had seen this game before, and they weren't playing anymore. In 1934, they sent him to the one place no one could reach him. Alcatraz. A slab of stone surrounded by the cold, merciless waters of San Francisco Bay, isolated, impregnable, unforgiving. It wasn't a prison. It was a statement. At Alcatraz, there were no allies. No favors. No special treatment. The guards couldn't be bought. The walls didn't echo with loyalty. And the man who had once ruled a city with a wave of his hand became just another number in a line of the forgotten. And then, something worse than imprisonment began to eat away at him, his mind. Years of unchecked illness, a slow, untreated infection of syphilis, began to take its toll. Capone's sharp mind, once his greatest weapon, dulled. Confusion crept in. He lost names, dates, pieces of himself. His past came back not in memories, but in delusions. He spoke to people who weren't there. Gave orders no one followed. By 1938, he was a ghost of the gangster he had been. Laughing at shadows. Muttering to walls. The doctors said he was no longer a threat. In 1939, after serving just 7 years of his sentence, he was released not with glory, but on compassionate grounds. They sent him to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. A palace for a broken king. There, surrounded by opulence and silence, Capone faded. He spent his final days wandering his estate, sometimes believing he still ran Chicago, other times unsure of who he even was. The empire was gone. The fear, the power, the myth, all buried under the weight of forgotten time. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of a heart attack. He was 48 years old. No crowds mourned in the streets. No rival gangs moved to claim his throne. The world had moved on. The man who had once held Chicago in his grip left behind no empire, only stories, legends, and a warning. In the end, it wasn't bullets or betrayal that destroyed him. It was silence. Isolation. And the smallest law of them all, taxes. And so, the story of Al Capone didn't end with a bang in a back alley, but with fading footsteps in a mansion by the sea.